Our second speaker is Dr. Shahram, who's going to talk about was Marx a Eurocentric thinker? He's going to tackle the question whether Marx was a Eurocentric thinker or not.
Thank you, Muhammad. Let me just start off by thanking all of you for being here and for being such a good audience. I mean, we're running at like, this is the 7th hour, and this is serious. These are some of the most serious discussions that we've had in a while. So thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Next, I'd like to thank all of our comrades and friends from all around the world. From Africa, from Europe, from the US, people are here from practically every part of the world. And the interesting part is that all of us over here are united by one particular purpose, one particular focus, which is to try to understand and come to terms with, at some level, the inheritances that all of us share, the inheritance of injustice which all of us have dealt with in our own little ways. I often tell this to my students and my comrades and friends over here that kids all around the world grow up with stories, one kind of story or the other. I say this for myself, and I'm sure this is true for many of our friends in the audience as well, that most kids grow up with stories of fairy tales. I grew up with stories of partition, with horrors of partition, with stories that my grandmother told me as I was growing up of how her family in Jalandhar had to flee from the violence. And that has shaped my conscience, my consciousness, my morality, my values ever since. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Habib, which is truly unique in every sense of the term, is to give meaning and voice to these stories. And we're part of a great project. So thank you all for being here and being part of this conference. Turning to the question that brings me to this podium, whether or not Marx is a Eurocentric thinker. And I want to start off by talking about the relevance of Marx to post-colonial societies, to a discussion of post-coloniality, and why we need to talk about him. What is it about Marx that is relevant to our times, to our societies, and to discussions of post-coloniality? What is it about Marx? Why talk about Marx? And that preface will then turn towards the main point that I want to make in this discussion. Which Marx do we talk about? Which Marx? So the first question is, why Marx? And once I have, I hope, managed to convince you that there is something interesting there that must be preserved, I then want to move to the main question. Which one? Because as I will show, there is not one, as some people would like you to believe, but there are multiple Marxisms. There are multiple Marxisms. And since we are gathered and we're talking about inheritance at this particular conference, there is also the inheritance within the Marxian tradition. And not all of that inheritance is worthy of keeping or retaining. So if we are serious about Marx and Marxism, we need to know which inheritance within the Marxian tradition is worthy of keeping and which inheritance must be denounced. And this comes from someone who has been a part of the Marxist movement and scholarship in one way or the other, practically all my adult life. Okay, so let's start by talking about why we need to talk about Marx. And why today? Why now? Well, since we're gathered over here in thinking about ways of dealing with the inheritance of injustice, I just wanted to point out that it's not merely a question of inheritance in the sense in which the term is popularly understood. In the popular understanding of the term, an inheritance is understood as something which happened in the past, right? Something that happened once upon a time. Now it's gone. No, it's not. Let's not delude ourselves into believing that that inheritance is a thing of the past. It's right here. It's in the air that we breathe. It's in the clothes that we wear. It's in the food that we eat. It's in the tea that we drink. It's everywhere. It's in the games that we play. I was telling someone that the ICC, the International Cricket Council, the original word is not the International Cricket Council. It is the Imperial Cricket Council. That's where it comes from. So it's everywhere. So this inheritance is not something that just happened once upon a time. It is produced each and every day, each and every second. And if we don't do something about that reproduction, the reproduction of that inheritance, we've achieved nothing. So the key feature, in my view, which makes Marx relevant, is the fact that a crucial part of that inheritance, a key feature of that inheritance, is capitalism. Capitalism. The global system that we did not create, that we did not shape, that we did not benefit from. We did not benefit from capitalism back then, and we did not benefit from capitalism in the post-colonial, in the post-partition era, in the post-independence era. We never benefited from capitalism. And if someone believes that Pakistan or India or Kenya can become like England or France, well, my friends, you're wrong. Because if you're enamored by the richness of England, you have to understand the dialectic that England is rich because India is poor. That Holland is rich because Indonesia is poor. There is a dialectic. And without being aware or sensitive to that dialectic, i.e., without challenging global capitalism, we cannot begin to challenge the inheritance of injustice. So if you're serious about it, if you're genuinely committed to challenging this inheritance, at some point or the other, you have to start talking about the economic system that sustains that inheritance. And that inheritance, that economic system, has a name. It's called capitalism. That's my first point. Second, and this follows from the first, the moment you realize that any discussion of post-coloniality or moving beyond, developing a new creative way of developing, of moving beyond the inheritance of injustice, has to include a systemic critique of capitalism. The moment you realize this, the towering figure of Marx emerges immediately. Because, so what is it? What is it that Marx discovered that we must talk about, that we must discuss? What aspect is it that he discovered? Well, his main point, as far as I understand, at the highest level of abstraction, is that all human societies, and this is what makes Marx truly a universal social theorist, a universal philosopher. He begins with the simple idea that all human society, past, present, and future, is premised on the production of material life. Everything that you're wearing right now, what you ate for breakfast, the seat on which you're sitting, the room in which we're having this lovely conversation, is a product of human labor. Someone had to produce it in the past, in the present, and the future. Whatever you consume has been produced. You cannot consume or distribute that which has not been produced. So Marx's point is that how society organizes, arranges its production and its production relations shapes the politics the culture, the music, the art, the ideas of that society. How you produce, how you organize, arrange, work has an impact on how you think, on your ideas, on your music, on your culture, on your politics. And he uses this general understanding to develop a very sophisticated critique of capitalism, in which he argues, and this is the short version of the criticism that he develops. He argues that capitalism at its core is premised on a social theft, in which unpaid labor is extracted from the producers, from the laborers, and is transferred to the non-producing members of society in one way or the other. And at its core, this mechanism via which unpaid work and labor is transferred from producers to non-producers, the reason why the slave or the serf or the hari or the mazara or the wage laborer engage in this social theft, the reason why they continue, despite having an intuitive knowledge of this fact, the reason why this continues is why? Why does it continue? It has to do with helplessness. So unlike mainstream economics, mainstream economic theory, which is premised on choice, that the reason why some people are poor and others are rich is because you make choices in life. Unlike that particular understanding of the world, Marx's understanding begins with the notion that some people are helpless. And the only word in the English language that can be used to describe a situation in which people do something because they're helpless is exploitation. Abuse happens behind closed doors. It usually happens to helpless people who have no choice. The African who was stolen from Africa, as Bob Marley puts it, did not have a choice. The Indian who was forced to grow cotton did not have a choice. We didn't have choice. We didn't have democracy. What you and I have witnessed is hypocrisy. As Ho Chi Minh put it, there was one set of laws that governed the core: freedom, liberty, equality for the Frenchmen, and its opposite in the periphery. Its opposite in the periphery, in the colonized world. So the critique that Marx develops in Capital is that capitalism as a social economic system is based on a social theft, which is why Marx's tradition is a heretic tradition. And you really have to start whispering at this point, because someone will hear you and they'll put you in jail for thinking about creative new ways of going beyond capitalism, going beyond slavery or feudalism or whatever exploitative forms of production we've inherited. Now, the question of Eurocentrism. Every now and then, academics invent new terms, and some of them are really creative. Most of them are forms of censor, which will emerge now and then. I tried to make a list, which is quite long, but some of you have heard many of these terms, which will be used in the same sentence as Marxism: teleological determinism, Orientalism, Eurocentrism, linear historicism. The list is pretty long. Maria de Castro accuses Marx of presenting, quote, a Eurocentric model of political emancipation that completely ignores the experiences of colonized subjects. Nikita Dhawan argues that Marx failed to develop a critique of imperialism. Edward Said, the most famous of them all, goes to the extent of saying that Marx's representations are a racist orientalization of the non-Western world. Now, for those of us who are interested in developing a non-capitalist way of thinking about the world, and practically the only theory that does that is Marx and Marx's work, how do you come to terms with this particular dichotomy? In other words, how do you read Marx's economics as someone who has lived through the experience or has experienced directly or indirectly colonialism? How do you read Marx from the periphery? Now, to answer this question, which is the main question that I'll be dealing with, was Marx a Eurocentric thinker? It makes sense, obviously, given the objective, to define the term. And I've come across the term Eurocentrism in the post-colonial studies literature. It has been used in 4 broad ways. In the first way that it's been defined, it's a form of ethnocentrism, distinguished by the presumption that Western societies are superior, and the attempt to justify this presumption in rational and scientific terms. That's the first sense. Now, this particular discourse treats Western Europe as the political, economic, theoretical, and sometimes racial absolute with which everyone else has to be measured. That's the first sense. The second sense is that Eurocentrism is an Orientalist way of looking at the non-Western world, which has less to do with the real conditions prevailing there than with what Edward Said has called the European Western experience. So the world as a whole is imagined from a regional standpoint. Third, Eurocentrism can be a conception of development, which by means of a false universalism uncritically makes the cultural and historical patterns of capitalist development in Western Europe universal. And finally, in the fourth sense, it is an effacement of non-European history, or more precisely, of its influence on European development. So what is known as global history seeks to counteract this by focusing on the interaction between different regions of the world. Now, as you can see, a thin line separates the first 2 dimensions of Eurocentrism from racism. And this border is crossed when the ethnocentric assumptions are articulated in a discourse about essential differences. That's the moment when it's no longer a distinction between different kinds of ways of organizing society, but rather becomes a difference that is about superiority and inferiority. Now, let's go back to Marx's writings on India. For those of you who are familiar with this, when most people criticize Marx for being a Eurocentric thinker, and there are plenty of critiques around, what they are actually talking about is Marx's work on India. And let me say this, and I'm convinced that many of you, at least some of you, will find this provocative. Let me say, with all sincerity and clarity, that Marx's writings on India are Eurocentric, in all the senses defined a moment ago. In the first place, they one-sidedly treat Europe as a society with a superior technology, with a superior infrastructure, legal system, and so on. In this connection, Marx attaches special importance to private land ownership. And his assumption is, throughout those texts, that European property relations make social progress possible as a consequence of class divisions. So in that precise sense, he says that the situation in India is marked by this thing called Oriental despotism. And that Marx, let me say this, we denounce. I do not agree with that Marx, and there is no need to hold on to that heritage. Now that kind of prepares the way for the next part, which is the Marx that we love, the Marx that we accept, the Marx who is interesting and without whom any discussion of post-coloniality would be incomplete. Now, first things first, Marx's writings on India, his journalistic writings. Well, and here's the fact that some of you may not have heard about. There are 5 of them. 3 of them were written by his comrade Engels with his pen name. Marx used to live in a state of poverty now and then. Engels used to fund him. So his journalistic writings were a way of funding him. But regardless, the Marx that we own is the Marx of Capital. Capital was written in 1867. It was published on September 26, 1867, so exactly 150 years ago. His journalistic writings are from 1852. Some of you might be interested in this. 15 years elapsed between those journalistic articles and Marx's most mature theoretical work, Capital. Marx lived for another 16 years after this. He didn't publish anything. He died in 1883. He continued to develop his work. That doesn't mean he wasn't working. He was working throughout. It is only after 1867, after the publication of Capital, that Marx truly devoted himself to developing an understanding of the non-European world. He started learning Russian, for example. He started learning Arabic. His exchanges with Engels in his letters are so interesting because he's learning the languages and he's discovering all sorts of things which are not reported in the mainstream British press. He was living in England at the time. And this is the Marx that is opposed to teleological economic determinism. I found a really interesting letter. Someone from Russia writes to Marx, asking him, well, first of all, praising him, telling him how great his theory is, and how he had converted, this particular fellow, had taken Marx's chapter on primitive accumulation in Capital and converted it into a theory of development for Russia. So Marx writes back to him, to the editor of the journal in which that original article was published. And he says the following, so pay attention. He says, he's referring to this Russian fellow. He says, the chapter on primitive accumulation does not pretend to do more than trace the path by which in Western Europe the capitalist order of economy emerged from the womb of feudalism. So he's referring to his Russian quote-unquote supporter, he feels himself obliged to metamorphose my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophical theory of the marche générale, the general path, imposed by fate upon every people, whatever the historic circumstances in which they find themselves, in order that it may arrive ultimately at the form of economy which will ensure the greatest development of man. But, Marx says, I beg his pardon, he is both honoring and shaming me too much. So this is the Marx after 1867, not the Marx of 1852, which is a favorite of his critics, the Marx that I just denounced. This is the Marx who is developing an understanding of the non-European world. Finally, Now, as some of you may know, Marx couldn't live to develop a theory of colonialism and its impact on the economy. But his prospective works, which were published in the 1920s and are known as the Grundrisse, which is short, which is German for groundwork, suggest that colonialism would have received a much deeper examination in the remaining unwritten volumes of Capital. And these notes are extremely interesting. And they can be converted. You can draw upon them to develop an understanding of what the old man must have thought about colonialism. And while I was going through these notes to try to understand his theory of colonialism and its impact on any economy, I came across some really interesting insights. He says that one of the peculiar luxuries that colonizers have over the colonized, over practically everyone else, one of the peculiar luxuries that these colonizers have over everyone else is the fact that in moments of crises, they can use these colonized spaces and people and their populations and their resources to solve their internal problems. This is a luxury that not many people had. There are about roughly 200 countries in the world. Only 8 or 9 of them had this luxury. Whenever there was a crisis in Britain or in France or in any of the advanced capitalist economies, solutions were found in the periphery. Let me give you one example, which is closer to home. The American Civil War, 1861. As some of you may know, 500 years before the war began, the supply of raw cotton, 90% of the world's raw cotton came from the American South. Because it was impossible. It was impossible to make free laborers grow cotton. Slavery was the dominant mode of appropriating raw cotton, and most of it came from the American South. In 1861, the supply of raw cotton from the American South, from slavery, came to an end. It became impossible to make slaves in the American South grow raw cotton. A crisis emerged. This was the world's first global economic crisis. Sven Beckert has written this beautiful history of capitalism by looking at its central commodity, cotton. And here's what happened. As soon as this crisis erupted in the American South, British manufacturers in Lancashire, in Liverpool, went to work because there's a global economic crisis developing. Capitalism is tumbling, it's coming down. And they say, well, where do we get the cotton from? Because you need a very specific kind of cotton. Remember this. Machines can't accept every kind of cotton. You need American cotton, a specific kind of cotton. So what do? They conduct research. And they find 2 areas on the world map, on the empire, emerge as potential candidates. The first is Egypt around the Nile Delta. And the other is Punjab, the part of India that you and I inherited. So if some of you find similarities in the political economies of these 2 countries, it is not a coincidence. Their shared histories come from that particular incident. So here's the main point. And if you read the Grundrisse carefully, for that Marx, a Marx who is sensitive to conquest, what you will discover is that his notion of mode of production, which has been discussed by people ad nauseum, criticized, looked at, etc., is accompanied by an equally important term that he devised to understand colonized societies. and it is called the mode of pillage. And what that means is, very, very specifically, that different colonies served a different purpose in the empire of capital. One part was used to grow cotton. Another part was developed to produce tea. A third part was used as raw material. Fourth part was used as a labor supplier, so on and so forth. And how a particular colony was used, how a particular colony was molded to serve the interests of capital, was to permanently shape the politics and the economics of those regions. It continues to affect us. So, if you read that Marx, the Marx who is sensitive to not just the mode of production, but to the mode of pillage, the manner in which the colonizer extracts whatever it is that the colonizer wants to extract in that colony, you will begin to discover a truly revolutionary Marx who is sensitive to post-coloniality, who is sensitive to the idea that there is something fundamentally different between a capitalist economy that is sovereign and a capitalist economy that is subjugated. There is a fundamental historical difference between the conquered and the conquerors. So it is that Marx who is open and sensitive to the idea that the institutional structures associated with production, distribution of material life, which is the universality that governs his work, how we produce, how we appropriate that which we have produced, how we distribute that which we have appropriated, and who consumes it, who distributes it, who gets it. Production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. There is one Marx who is sensitive to the idea that conquest and colonialism shapes, crucially shapes, permanently shapes production, distribution, exchange, and consumption in a colonized economy. And the institutional structures that are associated with that particular mode of pillage emerge as a consequence of the structural changes that were brought about by colonial policy to articulate the conquered economy in the global imperialist economy. Final point. These institutions, these forms or modes of pillage that you and I inherited at the moment of independence, at the moment of our new dependence, will continue to haunt us as long as we remain a part of this global chain of capitalism. This is why Lenin is so important. Because if we are to talk about moving beyond this inheritance of injustice, we have to realize at some point or the other, the sooner the better. 7 decades have elapsed, and half of our kids in Pakistan are in a state of perpetual malnourishment. Capitalism has not worked for us. That is the bottom line. So here's the Marx that we own. Here is the Marx that you need to know about, need to learn about. This is the Marx who told you, do not trust imperialism, do not trust capitalism, not an iota. Thank you.
Thank you to Sharon for a very live and impressive